Puddle Lane. Mr. Grimble grumbles. Mr. Grimble grumbles. Mr. and Mrs. Grimble lived in Puddle Lane. Mrs. Grimble was always very cheerful, but Mr. Grimble wasn't. He was always grumbling. He began to grumble as soon as he got up in the morning, and he went on grumbling all day. He was still grumbling when he went to bed at night. Mr. Grimble began to grumble as soon as he got up. One day he began to grumble even more than usual. He grumbled about his breakfast. His tea was too hot and his toast was too cold. One egg was too hard and the other too soft. He grumbled and grumbled and grumbled. Mr. Grimble grumbled and grumbled and grumbled. Why don't you go out? Asked Mrs. Grimble. It's a very fine day. I don't want to go out, said Mr. Grimble. Then stay in and I'll make you another cup of tea, said Mrs. Grimble. I don't want to stay in, said Mr. Grimble. I'll go out. He put on his boots, but his bootlace broke. He put on his hat, but his hat fell off, so he grumbled and grumbled and grumbled. Mr. Grimble grumbled and grumbled and grumbled. He tied his bootlace. He picked up his hat. He took his stick and went out into Puddle Lane. Sarah and Davy, Harry and Gita were all in the lane playing hopscotch. What a noise you all make, grumbled Mr. Grimble. I do wish I could have some peace and quiet. Mr. Grimble went out into Puddle Lane. He went off down the lane, grumbling to himself. As he came to the archway leading to Market Square, he met the magician. Good morning, Mr. Grimble, said the magician. It may be a good morning for you. It isn't a good morning for me, said Mr. Grimble. You're a magician. You can do anything you like. I only wish I was a magician. Mr. Grimble went down the lane. He met the magician. I wish I was a magician, said Mr. Grimble. Well, I can't turn you into a magician, said the magician, but I can give you a wish. The next time you wish for anything, it will happen. The magician snapped his fingers. Remember, he said, you can have one wish. You can't wish to be a magician, but you can wish for anything else. So be careful what you wish for. The magician went on his way up Puddle Lane. You can't be a magician, but I will give you a wish, said the magician. It's not much use having a wish if I can't use it to become a magician, grumbled Mr. Grimble. If I can't be a magician, I'm not going to wish for anything. He looked out into Market Square, but he didn't see anyone, so he turned around and went back up Puddle Lane, grumbling as he went. Mr. Grimble went back up Puddle Lane. The children were still playing in the lane. I need peace and quiet, muttered Mr. Grimble, and he went through the gates into the magician's garden. Mr. Grimble went into the magician's garden. The first thing he saw was the Griffle. The Griffle was standing under a tree with his back to him. Mr. Grimble hadn't seen the Griffle before, and he was rather frightened. Go away, he cried, waving his stick. Go away. Mr. Grimble saw the Griffle. "Go away," he cried. "Go away." The Griffle turned round. He saw Mr. Grimble and vanished. "Well, that's a strange thing," said Mr. Grimble, "a vanishing monster. I only wish I could vanish like that when I see someone I don't want to talk to." The Griffle saw Mr. Grimble and vanished. "I wish I could vanish," said Mr. Grimble. But as soon as he said, "I wish I could vanish," Mr. Grimble vanished. There was nothing left of him to be seen but his boots and his stick and his hat. As soon as he said, "I wish I could vanish," Mr. Grimble vanished. Mr. Grimble looked at his hand. "Where's it gone?" he cried. "I can't see it." He looked down at his leg, but his leg had vanished. All he could see were his boots. "What's happened?" he cried. "Whatever has happened to me?" Then he remembered that the magician had given him one wish. "I do believe I've vanished," cried Mr. Grimble. "Whatever shall I do?" Mr. Grimble looked down at his leg, but his leg had vanished. Mr. Grimble turned and hurried back home. Mrs. Grimble heard the front door open. "Come in," she called. "You're just in time for a cup of tea." Mr. Grimble went into the kitchen. At least his hat and his boots and his stick went into the kitchen. Mr. Grimble was there too, but Mrs. Grimble couldn't see him. Mr. Grimble went in. Mrs. Grimble could see his hat, his boots, and his stick, but she couldn't see Mr. Grimble. Poor Mrs. Grimble got such a shock that she dropped the teacup. "Whatever is it?" cried Mrs. Grimble. "Whatever can it be?" "It's only me," said Mr. Grimble, sitting down heavily in a chair. "I met the magician in the lane, and he gave me a wish. He said I could wish for anything I liked." "Do you mean you wished you could vanish?" asked Mrs. Grimble. "Why ever would you wish a thing like that?" "I met the magician," said Mr. Grimble. "The magician gave me a wish." "I didn't mean to," said Mr. Grimble. "I saw a monster in the magician's garden. The monster vanished, and I wished I could vanish too. I forgot the magician had given me a wish. Whatever shall I do?" "I wished I could vanish," said Mr. Grimble. "Go and see the magician at once," said Mrs. Grimble. "He'll help you. You can't go about like that." "I'll go straight away," said Mr. Grimble. "I'll have a cup of tea ready when you get back," said Mrs. Grimble. "I shall need it," said Mr. Grimble. The chair creaked. Mrs. Grimble saw the boots and the hat and the stick go out of the room. She heard the front door open and close. Mrs. Grimble shook her head. "I wonder if we'll ever learn," she said to herself. "Go and see the magician," said Mrs. Grimble. She saw the boots and the stick and the hat go out. The magician was coming out of his house when Mr. Grimble came into the garden. He looked at the boots and the hat and the stick, and he guessed what had happened. He laughed. Well, Mr. Grimble, said the magician, I didn't think you would want to become invisible. I don't, said Mr. Grimble. I didn't mean to make that wish. It slipped out. Help me. I want to be myself again, just as I was before. Help me. Please help me. Very well, I will, said the magician. Mr. Grimble met the magician in the magician's garden. Help me, said Mr. Grimble. I will, said the magician. He snapped his fingers, and there was Mr. Grimble. Mr. Grimble was himself again. He looked at his hand. He could see it. He could see his legs too. Mr. Grimble looked at the magician. Thank you, he said. Thank you, magician. It was the first time Mr. Grimble had said thank you to anyone for years. Thank you, said Mr. Grimble. Thank you, magician. When Mr. Grimble got home, Mrs. Grimble gave him a cup of tea. Thank you, said Mr. Grimble. I needed that. Mrs. Grimble was so surprised that she almost dropped the cup again. And after that, although Mr. Grimble still grumbled from time to time, he didn't grumble nearly as much as he'd grumbled before, and he was much more careful about what he said. Mrs. Grimble gave Mr. Grimble a cup of tea. Thank you, said Mr. Grimble.